Hello and welcome to episode 12 from Irish Skies Pod. And in this episode, we revisit Shannon Airport on the morning of the 1st of March 1999. The weather made for a drizzly, wet and windy morning, with the wind being 260 degrees, 20 knots, gusting to 38 knots. Visibility was 2,000 metres in recent rain and moderate drizzle, with the cloud being broken at 400 feet and overcast at 600 feet, with both temperature and dew point being 11 degrees Celsius. Channel EXS6526 was a daily cargo flight and had first of all departed from Cologne, had flown to Dublin and was completing its last leg of the morning from Dublin to Shannon. Channel EXS6526 departed Dublin at 0816 and cruised towards Shannon at flight level 120 for an ILS approach to runway 24 and was asked to keep the speed up to stay ahead of a British Airways Jetstream 41 that was also inbound to Shannon. The details of this event are contained in the Irish Air Accident Investigation Unit report 2000/001. The AAIU report contains no cockpit voice recorder or ATC transcripts and stated that the cockpit voice recorder was difficult to interpret in some areas. However, in this retelling of the story, we're going to focus on the recovery from the initial situation that developed. The Ordnance Survey aerial photos of Shannon circa 1999 show the following points referenced in this video, namely the runway 24 threshold, the runway 06 threshold, the tower location, the runway 13 threshold, taxiway alpha, the Shannon primary radar head, and the honk bar. The overlay of the Electra on the topography map is for illustrative purposes only, and is based upon the recollection of the event by the approach and tower controllers, cross-referenced with eyewitness reports in the newspapers, and all in all, the event lasted about 15 minutes from start to finish.
Okay, my name is Nick Herbert. On the day in question, I was working for Channel Express as a licensed engineer. They're a fairly successful at the time cargo airline with the Herald fleet first of all, and then the company acquired the Electras. Operating in the main for UPS, I would say. We did a lot of work for them and the British Post Office. We flew mail around all over Europe, and the Electra fleet, as it became, we were using those to carry 17 tons of mixed cargo, but mostly packages for UPS, as I say, around Europe. And on the day in question, we actually set off from Cologne on the Monday morning, and I was on board with the other 5 that were flying with us that day, which is a normal crew. And I was a ground engineer, so it was my responsibility to look after the airplane. But I was English licensed, CAA licensed at the time. So I was helping, if you like, a sort of liaison and hands-on engineer, assisting the American engineer, because the aircraft N285 was registered it's an FAA airplane operating under FAR regulations. And so we wet leased it basically from Renown Aviation in Roswell, New Mexico. So there was an American captain, American co-pilot, flight engineer, and another American ground engineer on board the airplane, plus myself and a Channel Express loadmaster. Now, the 6 of us were all sat on the flight deck, and we basically flew from Cologne uneventfully. Landed at Dublin, offloaded most of the cargo there, took off out of Dublin to land at Shannon and do a day stop at Shannon, which was going to be the routine. We took off out of Dublin and made the normal approach into Shannon. Now I was dozing. I was sat in one of the 2 supernumerary type seats on the flight deck. It was a fairly roomy flight deck on the Electra. It was quite comfortable. The other ground engineer was sat in the jump seat behind the captain, which was providential as it turned out. The loadmaster was sat facing me in the other supernumerary seat, and the other 3 crew were in their normal seats. Captain on the left, co-pilot on the right, and flight engineer in the middle.
So, Tom, you were the approach controller on that morning. So traffic will be handed off to you at about 50 miles from touchdown.
The weather was poor. It was about, at that particular time, I'd say it's about 2,000 metres, cloud at 400-600 feet. there was nothing uneventful about the whole thing. It was just a simple approach. I took him straight on to the localizer, no problem. Descended, no problem. And handed him over to the tower for landing. My work was done. I was hoping to go home.
My name is Davin O'Regan. I'm an air traffic controller, and I was on duty as a tower controller on the 1st of March 1999 when the incident happened. There was just two of us in the tower. There was myself and there was one assistant on the assistant position. The weather was very misty. I think the official weather was 3,000 metres in moderate drizzle, and it actually seemed a little bit worse than that because we couldn't see basically half the runway. When we looked towards the 24 end, we could only see from about runway 1331 and to the 06 end. So it was quite overcast. Yeah, it was just a typical morning in Shannon. It was very quiet at the time. There was only, as far as I can remember, two inbounds. There was the Channex was number one, and there was a British Airways Jetstream 41 was number two. So the approach controller was sequencing the traffic, and the Channex was handed over to me as number one, and I cleared the aircraft to land, and I didn't think any more of it. Normally, if we can see the landing gear, if it was a nice day, the assistant would look out with binoculars and check if the landing gear was down, but on this occasion, there was no way to verify visually that the landing gear was down on the aircraft. I wasn't able to see it because of the visibility. And the first thing I saw was when it came out of the mist, it was around the runway 1331 threshold. And I just thought that the aircraft did a touch and go or had a bumpy landing. And I just thought that it was just coming around to do another approach. But what struck me was that it was really climbing out very slowly, and it veered to the right of the runway and basically went over the grass very, very slowly and climbed. And then I knew that there was something wrong, but I didn't still know what it was until the aircraft came abeam the tower, and then I saw something falling off of the aircraft. So I immediately hit the crash alarm to get the fire engines to turn out because I knew something was wrong, and I told them that I'd seen something falling from the aircraft. And then I said to the pilot, I said, I've seen something falling from your aircraft. Is everything okay? And there was no response. So then, of course, I immediately said it again. And the only response he gave was, we request to return for landing. He didn't say mayday, or he didn't mention emergency. And I just gave him the standard go-around procedure. I told him to climb runway heading, climb to 3,000 feet, and I switched him over to the approach frequency. No, I lost sight of him pretty quickly when he did the missed approach, and I lost him at about 300 or 400 feet. I couldn't see him, and I didn't see him anymore again. When the aircraft contacted approach, I was listening to the approach frequency on my panel, and the pilot checked in. The approach repeated the instruction to climb runway heading 3,000 feet, but the pilot said he was unable to climb to that altitude because his aircraft was impaired. And as far as I remember, there was only a primary signal on the aircraft, as I believe the transponder cable underneath the aircraft was impaired during the incident, and the aircraft was unable to be seen on secondary radar. What was very lucky was that it didn't hit the primary radar head in Shannon, which is basically abeam the tower. So it was pretty close to hitting the primary radar head, and if it did, then the aircraft would not be able to be observed on primary radar, and it would have been a much worse situation, as he would not have been able to be guided back to the airfield.
So later I got this call from the tower and said the Electra is doing his overshoot, go around. So as I said, go around is 3,000 feet, back around again, landing. No, nothing wrong, as I thought. He climbed, but I called him and he said he was at, I'd think an margin about 400 feet. If he was at 400 feet, he'd be lucky, I'd say. So I asked him, could he climb higher? And it was silence for a split second, and he said, no, he wasn't able to go any higher. He'd lost an engine.
I wasn't aware that there was debris on the runway until the fire crew and the British Airways reported it. The British Airways landed first, and he reported debris on the runway, which I wasn't aware of. And then around the same time, the fire crew got to the edge of the runway, and they also reported the debris. So then we informed the aircraft, the Channex, about the debris, and he said, his reply was, I know, that's our engines. That was the first indication that we got that something maybe catastrophic had happened to the aircraft?
Yes, number 3 engine actually was gone. Then he said to me, it fell off. It's gone. Oh, the engine actually had falling off somewhere in around the honk in that area. Then he proceeds to tell me that the number 4 engine is damaged, shut down, gone. Number 2 engine wasn't fully operating. And then he told me that there was a hole in the cockpit. Part of the engine propeller, I think, had gone right through the cockpit. I think out through the roof of it. So that didn't sound too good.
Basically, they were doing a routine approach. And in this particular instance, the 3 of us that were sat at the back, as it were sort of dozing, as you do. All of a sudden, our slumbers were rudely awoken by lots of crashing and banging, which was very unusual. We weren't expecting that at all. Followed by the sensation of taking off again, which was not usual. This was not the routine.
And now, unfortunately, we need to take a few minutes away from the story to get a bit technically about the onboard systems and also to look at the contextual conditions as detailed in the AAIU report, which contributed to the situation that developed that morning. And we'll return to the lads shortly. I'll leave a link to the AAIU report in the description, and I'll put the extracted information here in the video in a PowerPoint view, so that if you want, you can rewind, pause, and reread the detail for yourself. During the approach, the pilot flying will call for the landing checklist, and the flight engineer reads out items 1 to 7 as shown, and both he and the non-flying pilot carry out the required actions, with the first item on the checklist being gear, down, 3 greens, from both the captain and first officer. However, as stated in the AAIU report, for some reason, which the crew stated was an inexplicable oversight, the normal landing checks were not carried out, and not one crew member realised that the undercarriage gear was not down and locked. The Electra was equipped with a GPWS which operated in 5 modes. And mode 4 is subdivided into 4A, which provides a warning if the aircraft penetrates below a nominal 1,000 feet rad alt, with the landing gear handle not down, and 4B, which provides a warning if the aircraft penetrates below 200 feet rad alt, with the gear down but with the flaps not in a landing configuration. On this aircraft, the voice warning for 4A and 4B is similar. However, the AAIU also identified the potential, unique to November 285 Foxtrot, for the flight crew to misinterpret the GPWS warnings and to inhibit genuine activations. Besides November 285 Foxtrot, Renown Aviation operated 2 other Electras, which had a GPWS system that had a flap override switch that allowed the GPWS to accept 78% flaps as the landing setting, but did not inhibit the other GPWS warnings. However, the GPWS on November 285 Foxtrot was manufactured by a different manufacturer and did not have this override facility. On November 285 Foxtrot, the use of 78% flaps is permitted and was selected in accord with the operator's SOPs for the prevailing landing conditions. However, the GPWS will have to be inhibited to prevent the GPWS from sounding a Mode 4B flap warning at 200 feet rad alt. The GPWS sounded at about 700 feet above ground, and the flight engineer reached up and inhibited the GPWS. He said he did this because he understood the aircraft to have 78% flap setting for landing, and that this is why the GPWS warning sounded. The AAIU concluded that the flight engineer confused this first warning with the below 200 feet rad alt warning when the flaps are set at less than 100% for landing. The AAIU also stated the fact that this particular aircraft had no flap override switch, as the other 2 aircraft in the fleet had, would probably have added to this confusion. It's not clear from the cockpit voice recorder whether or not the flight engineer was instructed to inhibit the warning. However, in their debrief with the AAIU, the other crew members agreed that the flight engineer would have been correct in inhibiting the GPWS, as they were landing with 78% flaps configuration, and the AAIU concluded that they therefore also misinterpreted the GPWS warning. The Electra is also equipped with a landing gear warning horn, which is programmed to activate when the landing gear is not down and the throttles are retarded for landing. The landing gear warning horn on the Electra is wired through the engine power levers and the flap handle. There is a button on the right side of the pedestal which will silence the landing gear horn warning with the flaps set between 0 and 78% and is pressed and held before the power is reduced at or below the position where the power lever switch would activate the warning. The AAIU stated, as the throttles were being retarded, the flight engineer pressed the warning horn button to prevent the alarm from sounding. It could not be determined from the voice recorder whether or not he was instructed to do so. During the final stage of landing, the throttles were advanced again, and it was only when these levers were slightly advanced just before the round-out stage that the landing horn system was again primed and subsequently sounded. During the round-out, the landing gear horn again sounded as the throttles were retarded. And the AAIU concluded, at this stage there was too little time to lower the undercarriage, and 5 seconds later, the propellers struck the runway surface. And so, with the technical bits out of the way, and with a link to the AAIU report in the description, we return to Nick, Tom and Davin as they tell us of the incredible recovery from this situation.
Our slumbers were rudely awoken by lots of crashing and banging, which was very unusual. We weren't expecting that at all. Followed by the sensation of taking off again, which was not usual. This was not the routine. Lots of flashing lights and funny attitudes, and the airplane was jinking about all over the place, unusually. So there was a lot of noise from down the back. So I opened the flight deck door. They weren't locked in those days. And wandered out onto the mostly empty cargo deck. And there was only a couple of empty bins down the back, luckily, which helped. And we were low on fuel as well, which also helped, which means basically we weren't very heavy. So the aircraft was now climbing away, but it wasn't climbing smoothly. It was all sort of all over the sky. And there was a big cloud of flying wooden splinters as I came out onto the cargo deck. This was being sucked out by a great big hole that was in the fuselage. Now, that hole had not been there when we took off. I'm quite sure of that because I tended to look for these things. So there was a big hole in the fuselage on the right, down near the floor. And there was another hole up above my head by the cargo door frame, which was, again, not usual. And as it turns out, there were other holes and things in the airframe. Now, I looked out through the big hole, but when you looked out through this big gaping hole in the right side of the fuselage, there was an obvious discrepancy in the number of engines. Like one of them was missing. It weren't there at all. We'd taken off, and again, I counted the engines, and there was 2 on one wing, 2 on the other wing, and this time now, when I looked out through the hole, only 1 engine was left. The other one had snapped off. It had gone, and it had left lots of big holes, apparently from the shrapnel, because basically the propeller, the constant speeding propellers on that particular version of the Allison 501D13 engine turboprop, the propeller blades, which are big and heavy, are made of steel. They're hollow, so they're as light as they can be, and they're quite strong and sturdy because they have to absorb a couple of thousand horsepower or more. But if they hit something hard, as happened in this case, then what had happened was when the aircraft first touched the ground at Shannon with the gear up, as it turned out, it had hit. The first thing that had touched the ground, the runway, was the tips of the number 2 propeller. That's the left-hand inboard. And that impact had bent the prop tips on the number 2, but the number 2 kept running, as did the number 1, which was unscathed. That impact rocked the aircraft across to the right. This is all where it steamed down the runway. And then the number 3 hit the ground much harder. And the propeller and the gearbox and half the engine or most of the engine said, we're not playing this silly game anymore, we're leaving. And that's what they did. They parted company with the wing, and in doing so, they broke up the propeller blades, snapped off, or bits of them snapped off. Now, several bits of this propeller blade from the number 3. As it left, they made great big holes like shrapnel in the number 4, which killed the number 4, stopped it running, although it was turning, it was windmilling, and that was causing drag. So what we had was a big jagged stub on the number 3, which was causing drag. We had a big propeller that was just windmilling, like those little plastic things that the kids have at the beach, which was causing drag on the right side. And then on the left side, we've got the inboard engine, which is not achieving the power it should do. And we've got the number 1, which is working fine. So we've got it's all asymmetric, like you wouldn't believe. And basically the aircraft is trying now to pull to the right because of all the drag on the right side, and what little power there is on the left. So the crew is struggling to keep the yoke over to the left, to keep it on as even a keel as they can as they climb away to get clear of the ground, and then figure out what the problem is and what to do about it. So I'd seen what was happening. I had a quick look around. There's no fuel leaks that I could see, no fire that I could see, which is important, obviously. I went back and reported this to the crew on the flight deck, but of course, with all the noise from the holes, it was difficult for them to hear what anyone was saying. So there's a lot of shouting going on, and there was a lot of effing and words of discomfiture from the flight engineer. He wasn't at all happy. The first officer was helping to fly the airplane, and he was talking on the only one radio that was still working. That was working off a battery, the battery that was on the flight deck. Because as it happens, as I found out when we finally landed, that number 3 propeller, when it shattered and killed the number 4, had also bits of it gone through under the floor, and it had severed most of the looms that carried all the essential electrics from all around the airplane. So we had very little in the way of proper instruments. We had a couple still working, and one of the instruments that was working, bearing in mind we're now climbing up into cloud, it was fairly low cloud base that morning, so the captain was looking at his one remaining blind flying instrument, which was the standby artificial horizon, again working off a battery which was on the flight deck behind one of the panels. So that was working, but he had his right elbow occluding that instrument. He couldn't see it because he was holding the yoke over to the left to keep the airplane straight. So what was happening was the other ground engineer sensibly stayed where he was in his seat, probably strapped himself in a bit tighter, and then he was bellowing into the captain's ear what that indicator was showing. And from that, the two of them were working as a team, and they were able to fly the airplane.
Now, work had to start because there was high ground, heading straight towards high ground, out towards the West Limerick and the Kerry side. Pretty high ground, all right. And certainly at 400 feet, he wasn't going to get over the high ground. So work had to start. I asked him, could he turn? And the answer to that was slowly. And slowly. So I gave him a turn. I gave him a good turn. No answer. Good turn. No turn. Another turn. I gave him a turn. I kept turning. I kept talking to see, I didn't want him to feel alone on this thing. And then all of a sudden, I just saw the slightest turn. Now, I was relieved. And I kept turning and turning, and he kept turning. He kept following me at that stage, which I was quite happy about. Heading back towards, well, it would be west of Limerick anyway. I didn't want to bring him over anywhere over the city. To bring him down towards, down towards Bunratty in that area. But the turn he was taking him towards Woodcock. Big worry there. And what I didn't know in actual fact, and you might smile about it, is that he crossed the main road from Limerick to Shannon with the people coming out to work in their cars, and of course wires dangling, piece of engine dangling, and I think it was a kind of for people coming out to the funny looking sight, but for me it wasn't like. But my biggest worry was Woodcock Hill, and he was actually heading for Woodcock Hill. And the same thing went on about the turns. And eventually I got a turn into him. I just actually kept speaking, I kept talking, I kept with him all the time. And I think it was probably the right thing to do. I didn't want him to be alone in this goddamn thing. So he did turn, and he did turn away from Woodcock Hill Road. I was quite happy about that.
In the bay that where the piece of steel propeller blade had gone through, and you could see all these tufts of wire that somebody had gone in there with a shotgun and blown them apart from, and this is the important bit, this is why I'm talking to you now and why the other 5 guys are still alive. There was one loom that wasn't touched, and that one loom wasn't essential. It wasn't really necessary. It was carrying all sorts of bits and bobs and wires for things that weren't terribly vital for the airplane to function. But it also was carrying an extra wire, because the way the airplane works, most of people have driven a car with power steering. If you've driven a car with power steering and you try and steer it with the engine off, it's very hard to turn the steering wheel. Now, flying an airplane like the Electra without hydraulic assistance for the flying controls is about the same. So there are 3 hydraulic pumps, and normally you fly along with 2, or maybe just the one. And we'd had a problem about a month before where one of the hydraulic pumps was intermittent. It was on and off and on and off. It wasn't a big deal because there was another 2. So we eventually found the problem was a broken wire between a plug under the floor and a plug in what they call the E-bay, the electronics bay. So we'd found this broken wire, and the easiest way to fix the problem temporarily until they could get it into a hangar and do it properly was to put an extra wire in, which is what we did. So we soldered an extra wire into the plug where it come from under the floor in the flight deck to the plug in the relay down below, and now that pump worked reliably. Now, the other 2 pumps didn't work anymore after this event because their loom carrying their wire, their power wires, had been obliterated by bits of propeller. So we had 1 pump, but another problem, the only generator we had there, normally the Electra is called the Electra because it's originally all electric. The air conditioning, the heating, all that kind of stuff was all electric. So it had 4 big 60 kVA generators. There are 4 of these, 1 on each engine, and normally you can fly along as a cargo airplane. You can fly along with 1 or 2 is good and 3 is better, but 4 is overkill, really. So the fact that the number 1 generator, bearing in mind the number 1 engine is the only one that was working without any problems, the generator on that one had failed and it was deferred. So it was in the tech log. We were going to replace it when we got around to it. Anyway, the 1 generator that was still working and supplying electrical power via this extra wire that we put in to one of the 3 hydraulic pumps in the back of the airplane that supply hydraulic pressure to the power flying control units, which enables you to fly the airplane. The only one that was still running was on the number 2 engine, which is the one with the vibration and the dodgy prop tips and all that kind of stuff. So a bit of an unstable situation. We just didn't know. We knew we lost an engine, but we didn't know about all the other damage. We could figure it out because lots of weird lights on the instrument panels, and so we changed that wire, and it's that wire, only that wire, that kept us alive. Because there is a facility where if you lose your hydraulics, you can deboost. The flight engineer can deboost. He can lift a little panel, pull 3 handles up, and he can deboost or unpower the ailerons, the rudder, and the elevators. So they're now flying mechanically with cables from their controls on the flight deck, with a cable all the way back to the actual flying control surface. But if you do that, you reduce your range of movement by 1/2, 50%. So bearing in mind that to keep this airplane more or less straight and level and land it properly for the second time, the yoke on each side. Well, they're linked, obviously. The yokes were fully over to the left, virtually. If you'd had to deboost, he would have run out because he wouldn't have had the range of movement. He would have run out of flight control, range of movement, and the airplane would have just gone badoof into the Shannon soil, and there would be 6 fresh graves in the cemetery at Shannon. As it happened, that one wire saved us. They wisely decided not to touch any of the power levers, leave them where they were, and feather the number 4, because there's nothing else you could really do. And luckily it feathered with the E-handle. You pulled the E-handle and it actually feathered. So that was another saving grace on the day.
Yeah, on the monitor in the tower, we have a radar monitor in the tower. I was just able to observe the primary signal of the aircraft. So I didn't know what altitude the aircraft was at, and neither did approach. The only way we had was the pilot's reports. And as he was turning left to come back around again to make another approach, he kept saying that he was losing altitude. He had to descend further, then he had to descend further, and he was step descending all the time as he was coming around back again to make the next approach.
Well, Woodcock was a big worry. And now I had the taller problem. As you know, there's high ground up in that area too, and he was heading straight for that area. And the talk had to go on, the speak had to go on. There was nothing else, only turns, and speak about it, and advise him about the high ground and the turns. And each time it took a little bit of a while before you got that little turn. And obviously because of the engine, one engine, he wasn't going to turn like that. And which meant I got him away from Tulla, which was quite happy. I was quite happy about that. Now, if I got him to the west side of the runway, it was much easier to bring him back in, turning left all the time. And I got him through the centre line before Tulla, well before Tulla, and brought him out to the west a little bit and kept my just turning again. But I could just see, in my mind's eye, I could see dangling engines, no engines, and it's still a worry. But I found that I was in kind of a little tunnel. I'm not sure what I could describe it as. It was just me and him. There was nothing else. Only just the two of us. And I felt darkness, just looking at one thing only. I could see him. I could see a big problem of hitting something. I didn't think I'd get him back I didn't actually think I'd get him back to the runway. But we kept on our turning, and we kept turning, and I got him turning back towards the centre line of the runway. Now, I wasn't going to take him far out. I was going to just head him straight for finals, as much as I could, as far out as I could. And that was about, I'd say, heading for about 3 miles finals. 400 feet, there was no problem. Probably 300 feet at this time. And he kept coming and kept my turning, and eventually heading towards the 3 mile centre line, he said he saw the runway, which I was quite happy with it. And I said, can you make a landing from that position and your direction? He said, I can. So I left him do his own thing for the landing. There was no point I can start turning an aircraft when he said he can. So I left him as he was, just calling the wind, just calling wind out to him, calling wind, just to keep something going between us. And he headed straight for the end of the runway. And he made his landing. I got a clearance from the tower, cleared at end. I didn't give him to the tower because I didn't want him changing his frequencies, because it was too much work for him. And he landed, headed down the runway, I think down towards the end of the runway, say about 500-600 meters from the end of the runway, which is a long ways down, and he landed, and he said he was on the ground. I didn't go anywhere near anything to see was he on the ground. I kept my mouth shut until he said he was on the ground, and I said, change to the tall woman 8.7. I still felt I was somewhere else. It was a funny feeling. And eventually I just happened to turn around out of my little bubble. I had an audience. I didn't realise I had an audience. There were 7 or 8 people standing behind me looking at what's going on. I didn't know that. And they didn't make a sound. So I thought, yeah, this is something different, all right. Like, he was on the ground. I was happy, very happy.
Everything was in place. The fire crew were in place for just in case that he had a problem on landing. I remember the aircraft going through the localizer, basically going through the final approach. And I figured that was because they had a problem with their equipment. So I didn't see the aircraft anymore. And obviously then there was a break in the cloud or the mist, and he just spotted the runway, and he basically went for the threshold. As far as I remember, that they had to wind the landing gear down manually because the hydraulics were all broken. Even when he landed, he was obscured on the runway for a while because the mist and the drizzle was still there, so I couldn't even see him when he landed again. Assistance was sent to me in the tower also because it was a pretty stressful situation, and I was just hoping and praying that the aircraft would get back on the ground safely. Without being able to do anything about it, just not even being able to see it. When I saw the aircraft on the ground, eventually, I knew it was really, really close to being a catastrophic situation.
I strapped myself back in again. The loadies changed seats. When I strapped myself in for the last 5 minutes or so, when I was sat there facing the loadmaster and thinking, I don't know if we're going to get out of this one because I'm a pilot and it ain't natural. What we're doing right now is not natural. I told them that they lost the number 3 engine. I suggested that they feathered the number 4 to try and reduce the drag, which they did, and that made a difference to the handling of the airplane, which was good. And they put the gear down, and out of the 3 green lights that they should have had for the nose gear and the 2 mains, they had 2. So one of them wasn't working because of this severance of all the wiring looms under the floor. Now, they decided to land anyway because they had no other choice. We landed, as it happens, when they drop the gear with the emergency setting, which is basically you break a rivet when you go with the actual selector lever, you push it further down than you normally do, and you shear a rivet deliberately, and then it drops it basically with gravity, and it locked it. All 3 locked down, and we made a relatively normal landing, although we did scuff a couple of tires, but there you go. Now, when the airplane finally came to a halt, there was lots of strangeness about it all, because we came to a halt on the runway. I got up again, opened the cargo door. I thought that's the best way in case there's a problem and we have to get out in a hurry. Then that's, the biggest door. Let's open that bugger up so we can all get out. And as I did so, one of the firemen arrived and put a ladder up so we could climb out. And I took my camera and I ran around the airplane taking all the pictures that anybody has ever seen immediately after that event. They're all from me. Now, in my circumnavigation of the airplane and finding all the extra holes that there were, the spinner from the number 2, it had sheared off with the impact, but it stayed on because of the airflow, stayed in position. And I came around the front of the airplane. I looked up at the big jagged stub of the number 3, what was the number 3 engine. The EDC was just hanging on a manky old oil pipe and an electrical cable. So that the rest of the engine had ripped itself out of the nacelle and a big heavy gearbox. The next day, the airport received a phone call from a local farmer about this chunk of metal that had landed in one of his fields. We went to have a look at this in his field, and the impact point was quite obvious where it had first hit the ground. Then it had bounced, and it was on a direct trajectory for the farmhouse. So he was a very lucky man. We all think that the little people, the leprechauns in Shannon, were working overtime that morning.
Then the next day, when I actually went to visit the aircraft, because we could go to the ramp and see the aircraft, I was really struck by the enormity of the damage and how lucky the crew were to actually survive, because we went into the aircraft and we were able to observe the holes in the side of the aircraft where the metal had come in one side and gone out the other side. So it must have been really scary for those guys on board, and it was a great achievement for them to get the aircraft back on the ground with that damage that was done to that aircraft.
As we were making that final descent for the final approach, for the second attempt into Shannon, and I strapped myself in, and for the last 5 minutes of that descent and landing, A, we weren't sure that the gear was down properly, and B, we weren't sure what else was going to fall off or happen on the way down. So I confess I was scared at that point, as I imagine was everybody else on the flight deck.
I don't know how they managed to survive the hole in the cockpit, like, you know. Without, I think went through the side and through the roof, like, you know, something like that. I did eventually see the aircraft. Didn't look good, like. You know, I mean, you just wonder how he did it. I don't know how he did it. Without, you know, you hear about people being in problems and panicking, and there was no, even when he said the engine actually had fallen off. I know it caught me, but it didn't seem to worry him too much at that particular. I probably did worry him, but he didn't show the signs of it, like, you know. He was quite good. His recovery was fantastic. Very happy. It worked out very, very, very. But I thought his landing was probably the best part of it. The first landing wasn't, of course, like, but second landing was probably as good as you'll get, and probably better than you'll get, like, you know.
Nick has compiled his own personal recollection of the event in Pancakes, Propellers and Paddy's Field. And if you send him an email at njmarine@gmail.com, he'll send you a PDF copy. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this episode, please like or subscribe or share the YouTube video URL, and through the link in the description, you can also support the channel. And once again, I'd like to thank the many people who provided the material and information for the making of this episode.